what if I told you video games lie to you? Not in the traditional sense, but some things might not be what you expect. Like, for example, in Bioshock, whenever an enemy shoots towards you, their first bullet is guaranteed to always miss. Or in Doom, your last chunk of health actually has more hit points than the other chunks of health, so you get that feeling of barely surviving an encounter. Games are full of these kind of little lies, and that includes my own game Move or Die, so I'm about to go in depth and reveal all the secrets behind the invisible balance of Move or Die. Move or Die is a 4-player friendship-ruining game I designed a long time ago. The goal is to be the last player standing in a series of competitive game modes where the rules change roughly every minute. Now, balancing the mechanics of a game like this was no easy task. It involved tweaking various variables in order to make sure that the players will get the exact experience I intend them to get as a designer. This can be done in one of two ways. There is visible balance, which is usually a piece of information exposed directly to the player, like how much damage an enemy deals or how much health you have left. And then there is invisible balance, which is also my favorite kind. These are little tricks that games pull off behind your back. If you are developing Half-Life 2 and you want your players to have just enough health, you can check their health status, and whenever they break a seemingly random box, you magically spawn just the right amount of health you want them to get back. If you are designing Gears of War 3 and you notice that players tend to drop out if they don't make a kill in their first online game, then you secretly boost their damage when they first start off and pull it back to normal levels after they get a kill. These kind of invisible tricks go a long way, and you would be surprised to find them sprinkled in many of the games you've played before without ever realizing it. In Move or Die, in terms of visible balance, we have a mutator that players can specifically pick to slow down the movement speed of the leading player and boost the last player. But that's a pretty superficial way of balancing an experience, and it's only scratching the surface. The reality is, we have tens of game modes with unique mechanics, and on top of that, we have mutators that act as temporary modular interchangeable mechanics layered above what was already there, exponentially raising the number of possible mechanical combinations. So the act of implementing new content in the game in the form of a game mode or a new mutator takes very careful planning and an extensive amount of testing to make sure it plays nicely with every single rule combination in the game. It's far from an easy or a pleasant process. So this is when something I like to call invisible near miss comes into play. Back when I was designing the core pillars of Move or Die, my goal was to make sure that most games will end up in very close calls. This would hopefully create high tension build-ups, leading to a memorable conclusion where every player feels like they have a chance to become the winner at the end of the game. An example of this from another game would be the sneaky trick in System Shock, where the last bullet shot by the player deals way more damage, killing whatever enemy they were aiming at, creating that feeling of just barely making it out alive. Or how in Mario Kart, the first player has a lower chance of getting good items while the last player ends up with the blue shell, almost all the time, which was specifically designed as a balancing item. In Move or Die, each game mode has an internal intensity score that doesn't show up anywhere in the game, and it's never revealed to the player. It's strictly for our invisible AI director. Game modes focused on getting the highest score, where players kind of do their own thing without paying attention to their competitors, are scored as low intensity. These are game modes that don't really feel competitive because you're not directly interacting with other players. Instead, you're focused on doing your task as best as you can to get the highest score, be it running around to color tiles or cleaning up the background. Not very exciting. Based on how the game goes, the invisible AI director will craft a pseudo-random selection of game modes to throw at the player. These will be selected based on their intensity score in order to create a specific tension curve and build up leading to the game's conclusion. This is also known in the industry as a flow channel curve.
If it's got a very high skill requirement but low challenge, then a game becomes quite boring.
As players approach the end of the game, the AI director will exclusively select the top intensity score game modes to make sure that things are going to end on a high note. Highly competitive game modes like Bomb Tag or Rocket Run are labeled as high intensity because they rely on players interacting with each other, resulting in a single player remaining alive at the end of the round through an elimination process based on skill. But intensity scores can only get us so far. If I want most games to end up in close calls, I must inject that concept into every aspect of the game, including the user interface. In order to ramp up the tension even further, we made sure to communicate which player is close to winning the game by using several cues within our interface. The leading player's score tower starts vibrating and flashing text shows up indicating that they are about to win. In Move or Die, players slowly gather points over time until they reach the winning goal. Normally, the game grades every player on a scale from 1 to 4, assigning points based on which place they come out in. However, when a player is almost winning, we require that player to definitively win another round in order to be declared the final victor, without giving them any points if they don't end up winning any round. This is a big thing, because back when we were still working on the game, before we implemented this rule, games would end up with the leading player winning because they simply accumulated enough points to reach the goal. This was very anticlimactic and confusing for most players, given that it felt like that player won out of nowhere. So with this rule in place, it's guaranteed that games will conclude in a satisfying way with the leading player actually winning the final round. Now, these UI hints alone make the other players aware of the imminent victory, and more often than not causing an impromptu team-up against the leading player, which results in even more chaotic fun and memorable experiences. But what about introducing invisible balancing inside each individual game mode? So we clearly didn't stop there with our invisible tricks. Even though the AI director throws high-intensity game modes at the players, we have a lot of little invisible balancing within those game modes. For example, in the high-intensity rocket run mode, players need to avoid a targeting rocket that explodes whenever anyone enters its range, allowing high-skill players to guide the rocket towards an enemy only to escape the explosion mere frames before it goes off. Normally, players assume that the rocket targets random players every time it spawns, but secretly, the leading player has a higher chance of being targeted over anyone else in order to keep the playing field balanced. In another game mode called Bomb Tag, you must avoid the player carrying the bomb, because if you end up touching them, the bomb will jump over to you and it goes off based on a countdown timer. Now, in order to make this game mode even more exciting, we give the player who is carrying the bomb a little speed boost to help them catch up to the other players. But we also slightly roll back the countdown timer whenever the bomb is passed to another player. And in terms of actual balancing, similar to Rocket Run, the bomb tends to prefer the leading player when the round starts and it has to decide on to which player it will jump first. Same goes for many other game modes in Move or Die where there is any chance for a random encounter. The leading player tends to be the least lucky one in our equations. There will be a more detailed video about invisible design in other games sometime in the future. I will try to put up a card somewhere here if I don't forget. But until then, it's time to talk about the mutators. I mentioned mutators before. They are a little something extra on top of a classic game of Move or Die where players have the option to turn them on before they start playing. If they choose to do so, every 6 rounds the AI director will pick a random player to select one of 3 random mutators. So for the next 6 rounds there will be an additional mechanic to take into consideration on top of whatever game modes are thrown at you. You probably guessed it by now, but those 3 random mutators are not exactly random. We label mutators into 4 categories. There are what we call fun mutators. These are mostly lighthearted fun twists on rules, such as Skin Swapper, which simply swaps the players' textures between each other. Or my personal favorite bluffing mutator, Ghosts, which makes players invisible whenever they move. We then have mutators labeled as movement, and as the name implies, these affect the player's locomotion in interesting ways, such as filling the levels up with water and allowing players to swim around, or cause players to be glued together if they end up touching, which I think is hilarious. And then there are handicap mutators, designed to throw a stick in the proverbial spokes of the players, like the ground turning into death blocks whenever you jump, or players unwillingly dropping bombs behind them at random time intervals. These labels are not exclusive though, as one mutator can have multiple labels at the same time, and every time players are asked to pick one of 3, we try to present them with a good selection of mutators fairly representing each category. However, there is an extra fourth mutator category we internally call clutch. And mutators from this category show up exclusively towards the end of the game. They are designed to raise the tension by bringing exciting new mechanics to the table, like the ability to project yourself forward and teleport to your projection at will, drastically changing the approach to most game modes and flipping established strategies on their head. Now, designing these kind of invisible tricks to balance move or die was pretty fun, but how can we make sure they actually work in practice? This is where the data comes into play. The beauty in all of this is that we can look at the raw data to determine that all these systems and invisible balancing tricks actually work. I went ahead and sampled statistics from a handful of move or die online games, and it turns out the average length of a game is 23 minutes. And rounds are designed to last roughly 1 minute each, so that means that the average game lasts 23 rounds. I was careful to only sample data from games without AI bots or quitters in order to get the best results. Now, out of those games, when they were done, the score difference between the top players was a single round in 53% of them. That means that the deciding winner of those games was under 1 minute away from snagging the victory, a gap of only 2 minutes in 17% of them, and so on and so forth, which is lovely. Now, if we consider a close call game to be a score difference of up to 3 minutes, then 82% of move or die games end up in a close call. And the last player isn't far off either, because out of all the data we sampled, including games that lasted almost 1 whole hour, the last player was an average of 6 minutes behind the winning player. So that's how we balanced move or die, with a handful of little invisible lies, and it was lovely to see these systems work together in practice whenever we showcased the game off at events and observed crowds of players reacting to those close calls. Now, if you are designing a multiplayer competitive game and you want your players to have a memorable experience, consider balancing your game invisibly, and if you do it just right, you might end up with players reacting to your game like this. Now, there weren't any sponsor spots in this video, and I hope you want me to keep it that way for future videos, but you're smart, so I have a proposal. If you've learned something new from this video, then consider engaging with it. And I'm not necessarily talking about subscribing, but instead liking or disliking the video, or even better, leaving a comment might be the best way to feed the algorithm, because after all, we must feed the algorithm. So without asking you to sign up for Patreon, the best way of keeping these videos sponsor spot free is to engage with them. And in the meantime, I will be in the comments below with some extra thoughts on invisible balancing that I didn't get to fit in this video. So thank you very much for watching, and I will see you in the comments.